Hello and welcome to yet another session of this course on literary criticism. We continue our discussion of F.R. Leavis, The Great Tradition. It's useful to keep this in mind that F.R. Leavis at that point of time, this is a work written in 1948, it's a post-war period, and he is addressing a new audience, a new English audience. It's a new educated English public, and he is also challenging the prevalent literary traditions, the prevalent moral traditions which were more in vogue before the war. So there is a kind of newness that he wants to bring in to this idea of literature, to this idea of evaluation, which is why he also says at the outset of this work that what he intends to do is a reassessment, a re-evaluation of this entire oeuvre of fiction. And he is also seeking to do something which poetry could never do. Poetry was never able to challenge any kind of literary tradition because the categories were always quite fixed. The traditions, the yardsticks, they were always quite fixed. And in terms of drama, there's already a sort of a hierarchy in place with Shakespeare as the most supreme author, as the most supreme dramatic genius. And so there's a way in which no kind of tradition was available for fiction, no kind of ready-made tradition was available for fiction, and the only kind of discussion which was possible about fiction was to arrange it in the chronological order, which is what until that point of time any discussion of fiction also had entailed. So here we find F.R. Leavis trying to go against that grain and to establish an English tradition. And there's something very interesting over here when he is trying to challenge this prevalent cultural ethos and when he is trying to reinstate a very evidently English tradition. We also understand that it's not entirely a set of English writers that he is roping in. If we take a look at the set of writers that he has in mind, where he also locates the great tradition, we find that most of them were at tangent to the English society. For instance, George Eliot, she's a woman trying to make her way in a man's world, and Henry James is an American who is making his home in England and also trying to write fiction in an alien land in that sense. And Joseph Conrad, of course, he's a Pole. He is writing in an acquired language. He is writing in a language in which he has trained himself very self-consciously. And D.H. Lawrence, he is not one of those mainstream cultural leaders of his time. He, on the other hand, he's a miner's son, and he was profoundly opposed to the metropolitan world that England was soon emerging to be. And if you look at F.R. Leavis himself, he is a tradesman's son, and he is working in an ancient university. He is working in Cambridge at the time of the composition of this work. And there are multiple ways in which we find that outsiders are becoming insiders over here. There is a new tradition being forged over here, and there is a way in which this tradition is being emphasized in such a way that outsiders also become insiders over here. And it is with supreme magisterial authority that Leavis also dictates these terms about what constitutes a tradition, and we would find these statements throughout his work, that he is very categorical, he is very authoritative in stating that this is the English tradition, there lies the English tradition, and there is no way in which he is willing to compromise on the kind of people that he is bringing together or the kind of yardsticks that he is using. And it's also again useful to remember that he is continuing the moralistic and humanistic tradition that Matthew Arnold had propounded, and there is a certain way in which we find a continuity with T.S. Eliot as well. So it is within these moralistic and humanistic impulses that we find F.R. Leavis locating his idea of the tradition, and it's in such a way that he is bringing together these 5 novelists as part of the great tradition. Another important thing in terms of his critical outlook is that he encourages the critics, he encourages the readers to look beyond the words on a page. So literature cannot be seen merely as a social document. On the other hand, it needs to be about an intimate study of the complexities, the potentialities, and the essential conditions of human nature itself. So here we find the moral compass, the humanistic compass, taking a higher standard as compared to any other thing which is associated with novel. Of course, the realist fiction was the kind of fiction which was being written from the earliest times onwards, and there was an increasing tendency to see the novel, the form of novel, as a social document. So Leavis encourages us to go beyond that and to look at novel as literature, as pure literature. And only when you look at the novel as a form of literature, as a literary form with a particular kind of a tradition, with a certain kind of a yardstick, he says only then it will become available for other kinds of scrutinies as well, for other kinds of purposes which are largely related to social consciousness. We'll very briefly take a look at how he tries to locate Conrad in this, because Conrad seems to be a misfit in many other ways, and here is Leavis trying to locate Conrad as part of this great English tradition. When we come to Conrad, we can't, by way of insisting that he is indeed significantly in the tradition, in and of it, neatly and conclusively relate him to any one English novelist. Rather, we have to stress his foreignness. So there is a peculiar way of looking at tradition. It need not be always part of the native continuity. It can also have a certain kind of foreignness, and it can blend into whatever is seen as the native. So this is unlike the way in which he tries to position. He had tried to position Jane Austen, and Conrad and Jane Austen, they might look like, they are at two ends of the spectrum, but we see the continuity being built in over here, largely on account of the moralistic and the humanistic impulses that F.R. Leavis continues to reiterate. Rather, we have to stress his foreignness, that he was a Pole whose first other language was French. I remember remarking to André Chevrillon how surprising a choice it was on Conrad's part to write in English, especially seeing he was so clearly a student of the French masters. And I remember the reply to the effect that it wasn't at all a surprise, since Conrad's work couldn't have been written in French. This is another aspect of the language coming into a very direct dialogue with the form that it is, which is fiction. Mr. Chevrillon, with the authority of a perfect bilingual, went on to explain in terms of the characteristics of the two languages why it had to be in English. Conrad's themes and interests demanded the concreteness and action, the dramatic energy of English. So look at the interesting ways in which he is locating the root of the tradition, the root of Englishness. We might go further and say that Conrad chose to write his novel in English for the reasons that led him to become a British master mariner. And also, he is able to praise what comes from outside. And remember what we mentioned at the outset of this lecture, that this entire exercise of reevaluating this tradition is also about making the outsiders insiders. Like he himself says very directly, like James, he brought a great deal from outside, but it was of the utmost importance to him that he found a serious art of fiction there in English, and that there were, in English, great novelists to study. He drew from English literature what he needed, and he learned in particular, in that peculiar way of genius, which is so different from imitation. So tradition here is not entirely about imitation. In fact, it is more about imbibing what is there, rooted in the tradition, but also contributing to it in a significant way. And here it does not really matter whether one's origin is native or foreign. Regardless of that, he is very interestingly looking at the work, and this is what makes Leavis very interesting for us as a critic. He also lays down a different kind of a standard for us by not looking at the ethnicity of the writer, by not looking at the biography of the writer. On the other hand, he's focusing on the work that each writer has produced, and which is what gives him a great deal of authority as well. He's very well versed in the works, in this body of work produced by these 5 great writers whom he identifies, and this familiarity with the work, it gives him the kind of mastery, the kind of authority to pronounce judgments about what tradition they are part of, and even to the extent of saying they are the tradition and there's nothing outside of them. And for us, who have him as well as the others, there he is, unquestionably a constitutive part of the tradition, belonging in the full sense. So just like Eliot, who had to become part of a culture, part of a nation that he was originally not part of, we find Leavis trying to become an insider and also be making others a part of this tradition. Here, the idea of the tradition is not constituted by what one originally is, but on the other hand, on the basis of what one has produced creatively by way of writing fiction. And now we come to this part where Leavis is also trying to tell us why he has not been able to include Dickens. Dickens, who has been seen as one of the most formidable storytellers of the 19th century, one of the greatest storytellers of English literature. We find Leavis excluding Dickens entirely from his discussion of the great tradition. While comparing Dickens with Joseph Conrad, this is what Leavis has to say. We may reasonably too, in the same way, we see some Dickensian influence closely related and of the same order in Conrad's use of melodrama, or what would have been melodrama in Dickens, for in Conrad, the end is its total significance of a profoundly serious kind. We find this emphasis on seriousness, on morality, on this moral compass, on this high sense of investment, on the idea of the morality, the moralistic and the humanistic cause very significantly being foregrounded over here. The reason for not including Dickens in the line of great novelists is implicit in this last phrase, that phrase being the significance of a profoundly serious kind. That Dickens, the kind of greatness in question has been sufficiently defined. That Dickens was a great genius and is permanently among the classics is certain. Look at the way in which he's also differentiating between great storytellers, between classics as well as this great tradition that he's trying to delineate over here. That Dickens was a great genius and is permanently among the classics is certain, but the genius was that of a great entertainer. That does not constitute great tradition. And he had, for the most part, no profounder responsibility as a creative artist than this description suggests. Praising him magnificently in a very fine critique, Mr. Santayana, in concluding, says, in every English-speaking home in the 4 quarters of the globe, parents and children would do well to read Dickens aloud of a winter's evening. This note is right and significant. The adult mind doesn't, as a rule, find in Dickens a challenge to an unusual and sustained seriousness. I can think of only one of his books to which his distinctive creative genius is controlled throughout to unifying and organizing significance, and that is Hard Times, because of its unusualness and comparatively small scale, to have escaped recognition for the great thing it is. Conrad's views on it, supposing it to have caught his attention, would have been interesting. He was qualified to have written an apt appreciation. So this is this sort of positioning I find very appealing. It's very interesting. Conrad is being seen as the successor of Dickens in a certain way, but at the same time, we find Leavis giving Dickens the credit only for writing classic short stories, only for being a master genius in his art, in his storytelling. But the kind of seriousness, the kind of profound seriousness that he would associate with Conrad, that's entirely missing in Dickens. And this is very interesting because just like Jane Austen, she has imbibed a lot from the writers who went before her, but the other writers the other writers assume significance only on account of the greatness of Jane Austen. In the same way, here, only on account of Conrad's greatness, Conrad's profound seriousness, we find Dickens entering this discussion. And it's a very extensive discussion that Leavis carries out in this entire work, and most of these things we find that his authority also comes from this vast discussion that he partakes in, and these are not loose statements that he makes. He also tries to very succinctly support them with definitive arguments from the readings that he has done. And he continues in terms of Conrad. To come back to Conrad and his major quality, he is one of those creative geniuses whose distinction is manifested in their being peculiarly alive in their time, particularly alive to it, not in the vanguard in the manner of Shaw and Wells and Aldous Huxley, but sensitive to the stresses of the changing spiritual climate as they begin to be registered by the most conscious. We find the moral compass continuing to dominate over here. It is about being alive to the times which are being presented in the fiction. It is not about the kind of ethnicity that one possesses. It's not about the kind of involvement that one has as a person. It's more about what comes through in that work of art, how in the work of art the aliveness to certain times is being manifested over here. And finally, he comes to D.H. Lawrence. Is there no name later than Conrad's to be included in the great tradition? There is. I am convinced one. Look at the authority with which he is bringing in names, and look at the uncompromising way in which he is placing them side by side as part of this great tradition. D.H. Lawrence. Lawrence in the English language was the great genius of our time. It would be difficult to separate the novelist off consideration, but it was in the novel that he committed himself to the hardest and most sustained creative labor, and he was, as a novelist, the representative of vital and significant development. As we know, there's a kind of selection that here Leavis has very evidently made from Jane Austen till D.H. Lawrence, picking on the kind of artist whom he thinks has imbibed the English tradition in its real sense, which is also an extension of the moralistic and humanistic tradition, if you may. And what happens over here is Leavis is beginning to look at literature as some kind of a religion. and there is a certain sort of rigidity which is part of his tenets, as we can see over here. But at the same time, there is a certain abstractness which is part of this. The yardsticks are though he is very authoritatively stating them, we realize that there is a certain abstractness which one could attribute to the religious frameworks as well. So, and here he is more direct in that sense, where he talks about it is the spirit by virtue of which he can truly say that what he writes must be written from the depth of his religious experience that makes him, in my opinion, so much more significant in relation to the past and future, so much more truly creative as a technical inventor, an innovator, a master of language than James Joyce. I know that Mr. T.S. Eliot has found in Joyce's work something that recommends Joyce to him as positively religious in tendency, but it seems plain to me that there is no organic principle determining, informing, and controlling into a vital whole the elaborate and analogical structure, the extraordinary variety of technical devices, the attempts at an exhaustive rendering of consciousness for which Ulysses is remarkable and which got it accepted by a cosmopolitan literary world as a new start. So here there is a personal investment over here when he is making these evaluations, and of course he is very widely read, and that sort of adds to this mastery, adds to this authority with which he is able to compare and contrast these different writers. He is in no way demeaning the other writers. He is in no way saying that the others are not master storytellers. On the other hand, he is quite well versed in the style, in the writing, in the craft that the other writers such as James Joyce or Dickens, the way they bring in their own genius into their art of storytelling. But what makes him very distinctive is this continued focus on something profound, something serious, something very personal, something very intense, which only certain writers, he believes, are able to bring into their fiction. So coming to the end of this first chapter, we find that he is further reiterating his claim. And one may choose to agree or disagree with the many yardsticks, with the many, sort of tenets that Leavis proposes. It is also perhaps difficult to corroborate many of the things that he says, because it's also based on his individual reading, and it's also part of what he thinks is morally profound, what he thinks is deeply serious, and what he thinks is morally enriching. So, and the intensity that he identifies in these works, perhaps it's also very personal. It is also about how just like Leavis, they also could become insiders to a tradition which was exclusively dominated by English literary writers. So coming back to the final passage over here, he reiterates what he claims right at the outset of this work. I have then given my hostages what I think and judge I have stated as responsibly and clearly as I can. Jane Austen, George Eliot, Henry James, Conrad, and D.H. Lawrence. The great tradition of the English novel is there. And this is a very conclusive statement. There is no compromise over here. This is a very categorical statement about what he thinks is English literary critical tradition. And what brings all of these people together is the myriad ways in which they have tried to become, they have been able to become part of this tradition, which was exclusively based on a lot of other things, including ethnicity. And here we find that none of these things are important when one is talking about tradition. It's entirely about the kind of work that one produces. Becoming part of a literary tradition is also becoming part of the spirit, part of the profound intensity that certain kind of literature, certain kind of literary tradition has always been giving out. And he is able to achieve two things over here. One, he is able to identify an English literary critical tradition which is essentially very different from the way in which it has been traditionally seen as. He is able to give a new definition, a new kind of understanding, a new trajectory to tradition, a new yardstick to look at the literary critical tradition. And on the other hand, he has been able to give a certain kind of a baggage of tradition to novel compared to the rescuing it from the state that it was before. From the state that it was before, where anything written as fiction could be part of this larger oeuvre. There was no way to find out what is good fiction, what is part of the tradition, what is not part of the tradition, because it was not like poetry, it was not like drama. There wasn't any set sort of template on which one could draw on, or based on which one could compare. So here we find Leavis being able to do two things: one, to redefine and to reinstate tradition in a different way altogether, and secondly, to give novel a tradition, especially in the light of it never having a tradition in the first place. So, having said that, the great tradition, Leavis' great tradition, many of his notions, many of his tenets they were challenged in the later decades, and many find it very difficult to come to terms with these very imperialistic notions about how to locate tradition and how to identify insiders and outsiders, and how to identify something which is a classic and how that is essentially very different from what goes on to make the tradition. So, many of these notions have been found very, very problematic, but what needs to be remembered at the end of the day is that Leavis had contributed immensely to this discipline, to this entire formation of criticism as a separate and distinct discipline, and to this formalized study of English literature and English criticism in a very novel sense. So with that, we come to the end of this work. I encourage you to read the remaining parts of this work for your own understanding, to see how he has taken this argument of moralistic judgment about humanistic tradition, how this argument has been taken forward to read particular works in greater detail. With this, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.